But now we need to continue to next. As I said, that was a good way to have a next speaker who are from ACEA, which are the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, and it is Thomas Fabian who will do his speech, who are Director of Commercial Vehicle. So please, Thomas, what challenges do we see in freight transports area for Europe?
Thank you very much, Thomas, and good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I think I would like to take a small step back from what Ben and Carl have just described and give our perspective on what challenges we as vehicle manufacturers see in on the road to carbon neutrality, and what is our perspective and our plan for the decarbonization of the wider sector, transport and logistics. So I hope I can switch the slides here. Yes. So these are the ACEA members in the commercial vehicle segment, the Europe-based truck manufacturers. And I would like to touch upon four points in my little presentation here. The key challenges that we're facing, the regulatory framework that we are currently faced with, and the question on how to enable and support the transition towards carbon neutrality, and finally, a few conclusions. Starting with the key challenges that we see. Obviously, I mean, I don't need to mention this. This is it's a very new setup for all of us. These hybrid conferences, online and physical meeting at the same time. We've all gotten used to working remotely over the last 6+ months. So COVID-19, the Corona pandemic, obviously is a huge challenge that is that everybody has been faced with, and is obviously also a huge challenge for our industry. At the same time, we're not dropping the ball on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And I mean, these are slightly older figures here, 2-3 years old. You all know the role of transport in climate change, and we all acknowledge the challenge that we are faced, and the need to decarbonize our sector. Among the key challenges here is obviously the growing demand in transport. We had quite significant reductions over the last couple of decades in vehicle-specific emissions, increase in fuel efficiency, obviously, on average, and you can talk about if this was enough or not, but on average, we had an improvement of vehicle fuel efficiency of about 1% per year. At the same time, we had growth in road freight transport of above 20% since 2000, which means, and you see the green line here, which means that transport demand has grown significantly, but eventually has offset the CO2 emissions reductions that we have achieved. And this needs to change, obviously. An additional challenge is the average age of the fleet, of the vehicle fleet. And just to give you a few examples here, the medium and high heavy trucks is the average age in Europe is about 12.5 years, and it's quite diverse if you look at the different countries. So looking, for example, at the Netherlands, a fairly young fleet compared to other countries with up to 17 years in age. And this is obviously something that we all need to take account of if we want to, and we're committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. But if the trucks that are running are in 2015 are 17 years old, then you all can do the math, what this means for the challenge that we are facing. So addressing the vehicle fleet and the age of the fleet is a challenge, is an important aspect. Another very dire picture actually is if you look at what is powering today's trucks. And it's 98.3% of all trucks run on diesel. The remaining here, about 0.4%, I think these figures are from 2018, ran on natural gas. but there's like 0.0 point something a number of vehicles that are actually zero emission trucks, zero emission vehicles, and this is where we need to be heading jointly if we can achieve and want to achieve this target of carbon neutrality by 2050 at the latest. So one thing from this picture becomes very clear, and it's the biggest challenge, obviously, is zero emission trucks require a radical policy change. Radical change, not only on the policymakers' side, but also obviously on vehicle manufacturers' side, but for the whole transport and logistics sector. Now, I mentioned growing transport demand and the average age of the vehicle fleet and fleet renewal. Obviously, the corona pandemic has not really helped in terms of fleet renewal. So this is something that we also need to address short and medium term. But we also face the lack of charging and refueling infrastructure, and obviously something what we call the lack of market acceptance for low and zero emission powertrains. There's no doubt that there's a huge demand for zero emission technologies, low carbon, low fuel consumption technologies out there, and the Aeroflex project has brilliantly brought together all the different pieces that need to fit together to actually transform transport and logistics. But the reality is, from our perspective at least, there's still a lack of real market acceptance. There's an interest, yes, but it's not low and zero emission powertrains, to the extent that they're already available, have not sparked like huge interest. And the reasons for this are different. There are different reasons. Some of I will try to touch upon a few of them and how we plan to address them in the next couple of minutes. Now, to the regulatory framework that we as vehicle manufacturers are facing currently. Now, it was already mentioned by Ben earlier, we have CO2 emission standard for trucks, and that means based on a baseline which we don't know yet. That's the 2019-2020 average emissions of the fleet of the vehicles of the newly registered heavy-duty trucks. Based on this baseline, in only roughly 4.5 years, the average emissions need to go down by 15%, and by 2030 down to at least 30%. Ben mentioned earlier that the overall climate ambition has been increased. We don't know yet how this, if and how this may affect the 2030 target for us, but it doesn't really change the scale of the challenge that we're facing. To put it very practically, I mean, if you look at the right-hand side here, the very last bullet point, we're faced with high non-compliance fines, and they are up to roughly 4,500 euros per gram per ton kilometer per vehicle, and that's only for the second half of this decade. So it is definitely something that we need to. So there's definitely a strong incentive, let me put it this way, for us to actually meet those targets. And ultimately, there's no other chance to bring down the average fleet emissions by 15% and 30%. Now, I don't want to bother you with the details here. Currently, there are a number of vehicle categories, segments being regulated. It's basically of different weight categories, the rigids and the tractor vehicles in different long haul and regional delivery mission profiles. The key message here is that if you look at the pie chart on the left-hand side, 68% of all emissions of the vehicles that are currently regulated come from just one subgroup, and that's the subgroup 5LH. That's the standard tractor-trailer combination, ultimately. So this is where we need to focus. This is where we need to bring down the emissions. And if you look at the right-hand side here, the subgroup 5LH, as it's called, 5 long-haul cycle, we already have an average, we have a rough understanding of what the starting point, the baseline for this segment is, and that's 56.5 gram per ton kilometer. About 95% of all vehicles registered over the second half of 2019 were in this 95% interval between 52 grams and 64 grams, which also means that they're fairly close together already. So there's fairly high competition between manufacturers to bring down emissions. But if you look at the next slide here, we need to go bring them down by 15%. And that's the first dotted line here. And then in 2030, we need to bring them down by at least 30%. And in the regulation, what is considered a low emission vehicle is a vehicle which with at least 50% less emissions than today's average. That means the last dotted line here. So that what it ultimately means is we need to bring down emissions really fast. We need to introduce zero emission vehicles in the fleet. Now, the question is how to make this happen. We are committed as OEMs to carbon neutral road transport by 2050 at the latest. This clearly requires, it will mean a seismic shift with major implications for all stakeholders in transport and logistics. We are committed to deliver on our targets, and we're willing to lead the industry's transition. But obviously, we're just one part of the puzzle here. We can't do this alone. We are starting to form, and the Euroflex project is definitely a part of this. We need more of these initiatives, starting to form alliances to actually make zero emission and carbon neutral road transport happen. From our perspective, this requires three key factors, and they're all interdependent. If you leave one of them out, then it's not going to happen. So all of them need to be in place to bring carbon neutral road transport into reality. First one is obviously reliable and efficient vehicles. Second one is obviously no one will invest in a battery electric truck, for example, if they cannot recharge it. So what we need is a dense network of charging and refueling infrastructure, which is suitable for trucks. And there's a difference. Obviously, the car charging stations that are out there increasingly are not suitable for trucks. We need the sufficient electricity grid network in the background to have these to power, to recharge the heavy duty trucks. And we need, third point, a policy framework which enables and drives the transition to carbon neutrality. One element, so our plan is, and I'm clicking through here to allow you the whole picture. Okay, charging and refueling infrastructure is suitable for trucks. I mentioned this. In terms of policy measures, this translates into, from our perspective, mandatory targets for member states to install to ensure that the necessary charging and refueling stations are being installed. And this needs to be coupled within enforcement measures. We need a policy framework which enables and drives the transition. And key in that is carbon pricing. We need CO2-based road charging. We need fuel taxation as an instrument. We need the whole measure or the whole range of measures that policymakers can use. And it has also been mentioned, it's still at the same time, we need to look at this from a holistic perspective. We cannot just rely on bringing zero emission vehicles to the market only. We also need to find a way to decarbonize the existing fleet, the existing vehicle fleet. Still, there needs to be distinct responsibilities between our part, the tank to wheel part, and the well to tank part. But we need policies to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of fuels. There's, for example, the Fuel Quality Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive. If there are ambitious targets as they are in place for our side, for the vehicle manufacturers, then we can decarbonize the fuels rapidly. And this will help bring down the emissions of the existing fleet. Now, we have a plan and published this already earlier this year, at the minimum, how many charging and refueling stations for the different fuels we think will be necessary in 2025 or by 2025 and by 2030. And obviously, the majority, the focus for the start is on charging. So we're talking about DC charges of the different technical requirements here. And what is frightening at the moment is the very first column. Obviously, we currently have none or almost none of that available today, but we need to scale up. If you look, for example, at the DC 350 kilowatt chargers already by 25 to up to 11,000 publicly accessible chargers. But at the same time, we also need to start building up an infrastructure network for hydrogen, compressed and liquefied, because there will be a need, and developments are on the way to bring hydrogen vehicles to the market. And finally, also natural gas infrastructure as a bridge technology needs to be scaled up at the same time. Now, the elements of the policy framework I mentioned, carbon pricing is key. I cannot stress this enough. CO2-based road charging, fuel taxation, but also tackling obviously the efficiency in logistics and the increased and more harmonized use of high-capacity vehicles is key here. Something we think needs to be considered. We haven't taken a strong position on this yet, but we also need to bring on board increasingly, for example, other stakeholders talking about zero emission zones in cities. Again, it's not an ACEA position yet, but it's something. It's what Ben also mentioned. It's the access of cities. But also thinking about maximum permissible CO2 footprints for transport operators. Crazy ideas, but something to really make sure that we all have the same understanding of the challenge that we are facing. Now, coming to the conclusions here, I just would like to reiterate that we think we're convinced that carbon neutral road freight transport by 2050 at the latest is possible. And we are willing to make this happen, to play our part in that. We're willing to lead the transformation in terms of low and zero emission vehicles. And but we also need, and we're inviting partners in transport and logistics to join us in this. And also policymakers on the European as well as on the member state level obviously need to live up to the same level of ambition and swiftly establish the necessary policy framework. And with that being said, I would like to thank you very much, and I'm ready and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think it was a really interesting presentation you had, and it's obvious that we need to act now, especially what you said about the average age of a truck can be up to almost 20 years in some countries. So if you should reach goals 2050, 2030, even worse, it's almost impossible to solve them now. But thank you again. And now it is time for a short 20 minutes coffee break here in the room, and you are online has also the possibility to get some coffee or something. So we will continue in 20 minutes, 11:15. So thank you so far.